Well, greetings and welcome everybody from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Sarasota and the Unitarian Universalists of Lakewood Ranch. We are happy to be in worship together again. I am Bud Friend Jones. I'm one of the associate ministers in this church. With me is Doug Wadkins, our interim senior minister, and Catherine Bonner, our director of education. Don Bryn at the keyboard. Robert Lachetti, our director of music, is leading our mass choir. Klaus Obermeit and Doug Caldwell are handling the cameras, the sound, the technical aspects of our service. And so welcome, welcome, welcome. Especially visitors. If you're visiting us online there, please visit the Visitors Center on the church's website. You can find a link to the Visitors Center on our homepage on the website, on the banner that is marked Welcome Visitors. It's pretty obvious. We invite you to register on the virtual guest book, and if you do, we will send you our newsletter. You are welcomed and encouraged and invited to attend all of or some of our virtual events. You get a Zoom link to those events by contacting our church office by email. There is a coffee hour today following our worship service. A Zoom link was sent out by email on Friday. And now we'll have a transition with music. To begin our worship together, I'm going to read The Heart of Our Faith by Monica Jacobson Tennyson. What is it that calls you here, that calls you onward, that calls you inward, that leads you homeward? What is it that gives you the power to make that change, to ask that question, to take that journey? What is it that says you have done well, that asks you to learn more, that brings you to stillness, that holds you up in hard times? It is relationship, the beating heart of our faith. It begins when we share this hour, our truths, this air, our hearts. And now we light this chalice in the spirit of the seventh principle, affirming and promoting respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we all are a part. Come, let us worship together.
Welcome. This month in our religious education classes, we've been exploring God, heaven, and hell from different religious viewpoints. And today we're focusing on, well, what does God look like? Well, you might be surprised that not everyone pictures God the same way. And so much of the influence of that picture is how we view ourselves. So here is a poem that I wrote. In the image of God are we, but tell me, just how can that be? When I travel the world and those that I meet are people who are unlike me, each unique, no two the same, except maybe the twins down the street. I see people who are super white and people who are dark, like the cool, cool night. I see coffee and toffee and peaches and cream, and all of them looking to fulfill life's dream. Some of us are super old. Some of us just broke the mold. I see teens and 20s just starting to adult, and those who would like to catapult back to those earlier carefree days, truly forgetting that we did not have much say. There are freckles and beards, bushy eyebrows and scars, hair that is gone or down to your feet, and smiles that are goofy or funny or sweet. All people come with a steady heartbeat. Some of us have muscles. Some of us have more bustles. Some of us can run, but not everyone. Some cannot see or hear the babies cry, or hug those of us that are shy. And each of us has, from time to time, doubted the looks of ourselves and others as being worthy of our care. But we are, all of us together. So how can we be all in the image of God? Well, because we are all alive with the spark, the capacity for love, for that is the image of God. So now let us sing our hymn number 21, For the Beauty of the Earth.
We move now into a time of centering, and we'll begin with centering in words, and then I'll invite you to a few moments of quiet, and we'll end our time of centering together by singing Spirit of Life. What if religion includes the sigh of longing breathed in an expectant, lonely hour of the night? What if prayer includes holding and being held, or feeling the warmth from the touch of a hand on the naked skin of the back? What if the sight for sore eyes, the pleasing fragrance, the sound so sweet it breaks your heart is the presence of the holy itself? Then the cathedral of the sacred might be the kitchen, the bedroom, the garden in full bloom, or the blanket laid out waiting in the sun. The faithful act might be the healing touch, or the willingness to be vulnerable to our need to be loved. Religion might be what the body needs, what it desires, and not just what the mind requires or the soul demands. Then the sensual, the sexual, the spiritual may be one of the many sacraments we offer in the worship of a holy life. So may it be. May we be together for a few moments of quiet.
Here, what I'm about to read, she writes about the erotic. The erotic functions for me in several ways, and the first is the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. Sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them. And it reduces the threat of their difference. Another important way in which the erotic connection functions is the open and fearless understanding of my capacity for joy, in the way my body stretches to music and opens in response, hearkening to its deepest rhythms. So every level upon which I sense also opens to the erotically satisfying experience, whether it is dancing or building a bookcase, writing a poem, or examining an idea. One reason the erotic is so feared and so often relegated to the bedroom alone when it is recognized at all is that once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from others and from our lives' pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy of which we know ourselves to be capable. Our erotic knowledge empowers us, becomes a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate these aspects honestly, and not to settle for the convenient, or the shoddy, or the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. This is our Share the Plate Sunday, and on this day, we are thinking especially of our brothers and sisters in the Community Church of New Orleans and the First Unitarian Universalist Church of New Orleans. You may remember, I'm sure you do, on August the 29th, the state of Louisiana was hit very hard with a Category 4 storm, Hurricane Ida. And it moved so slowly that it did so much damage. And that happened on the 16th anniversary of Katrina. Well, a little update about the Community Church of New Orleans. Gale force winds ripped the siding off their building and brought down wall panels and damaged their ceiling tiles. That congregation has only 85 members. Community Church of New Orleans and First Unitarian Universalist Church of New Orleans will be extremely happy and thankful to have our support. Any amount that you decide to donate will have an immediate impact, and it will be very, very much appreciated. And you can actually give right now by using the link below in the YouTube page. If you are viewing this page on a web desktop, you can likely access this link by hovering your mouse over the bottom center or leaving the full screen for a moment on other devices. And so we want to thank you for your generosity.
Thanks so much, Don.
So, once upon a time, there were two beings in a garden, and they were presented with all manner of wonderful things. All of these resources in the magnificent garden were offered as a resource. All of them, except for one particular tree and the fruit that was produced by that tree. That was off limits. Well, this has been a big month for the Garden of Eden story because Reverend Bud did an amazing job a couple of weeks ago of using that story to help us think about our relationship with the world. And the wonderful and maddening thing about mythological stories is that they're particularly open to being interpreted in so many ways. And Reverend Bud indicated how the story is often aligned with the idea of original sin. And at least one interpretation of what original sin is about is sex. And we have spent a great deal of time, we human beings, seeking to understand this myth in a variety of ways. He went on to talk about how often that myth fuels our sense of how we understand property. And there are actually some amazing parallels as we begin to explore what might be called sexuality. And it is certainly one of the things we'll focus on. But connected to that deeply is the sense of how we connect intimately with each other and with all things, how we understand the body, and how power is a part of all of those connections. To understand how this idea began to make its way into the world, we have to go back to at least Plato, who began to posit that there is a division between the mind and the body. That is often called dualism, which is referred to in a variety of different philosophical ideas. But in this instance, Aristotle and Descartes also began to weigh in that understanding. And there was this idea that obviously human beings had both a body and a mind, but understanding their relationship went all over the place. And dualism separated them out. And Descartes, in particular, set up the division in such a way that he over and over again emphasized that out of the two parts of a human being, the superior side was the mind. And as that thinking went on, and other people like Immanuel Kant and Nietzsche and David Hume began to weigh in, the idea of the mind and eventually sort of the soul of a human being became the place that was most superior and sometimes believed where the holy resided. And the body was often seen as this sort of shell that often tempted us to do terrible things, or was the base side of who we are. And from that assumption, we began to supply all sorts of other ideas. But, that was not the only idea that was out there from the very beginning. At the same time that Descartes was writing about dualism, Baruch Spinoza, in his work Ethics, proposed that we were unified in mind and body. And so many other philosophers and great thinkers such as Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre and Jacques Derrida, all of them also took that idea of the unity of humanity. So one thing that comes from dualism is this sense that things associated with the body, including sexuality in particular, are inferior and more base. And things that are more, shall we say, high-minded, and that's part of where the idea came from, those are the things that make us superior. And it makes a difference in how we regard our relationship to the world. But unfortunately, over time, it also makes a huge difference in how we understand our relationship to each other as well, in terms of gender and race. And so it's very hard, actually, to figure out which is the chicken and the egg. Because as many commentators have said, even folks who upheld the idea of the unity between mind and body were often plagued by deep racism and sexism in their philosophies. It doesn't necessarily eliminate it to have a unified vision. But we are clear that the more that you separate body and mind, the more likely you are to objectify, in the worst sense of that word. and understand bodies and things as objects to be used by human beings. And so over time, we turned that into a very complicated set of thinking that contributed to the messy place that we are in terms of thinking about sexuality. And over time, religion also began to weigh in very strongly in that division as well. Often, of course, coming down on the side of being rather anti-sexual, certainly anti-pleasure in sex, or sex outside of the idea of copulation that had to do with procreation, or in just for pleasure in and of itself. And when you add to that our ideas about sexuality and the word itself continues to change, that complicates things even more. When you go back to the original root of the word sexuality, sakare, that means literally to section off or divide. And you can see, if that is the root of the word, how that would yet again encourage us to understand sex as something that is divided from other parts of our lives. Over time, that word began to be associated with the Latin sexualis, which had to do almost entirely just with copulation or regeneration. And that was around 1799. It wasn't until 1879 that sexuality as a word came into common use, and it was the first time that the idea that feelings had anything to do with sexuality. And so you can see that our ideas, even the word itself, has placed sex in a particular corner of how we think about it that has often not been very helpful at all. But I point out that even in some of our oldest religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, the Muslim faith, and Christianity, there have always been people that have understood the importance of including sexuality as part of the spiritual. And many of those folks are mystics and have, in their experience of the holy, had such ecstatic experiences that it's easy for them to be carefully aligned or connected with bodily sexuality, although there's been great debate over the years whether those poems that sound like erotic poetry have anything to do with human sexuality. But Unitarian Universalism, when it began to think about how it is that we wanted to relate with sexuality, was very clear that we wanted to have a direct understanding that we brought into our congregations and be on the side, especially over time, of understanding sexuality as a part of what it means to be a faithful, religious, and spiritual person, and then explore the ramifications of that. And before I move on to Unitarian Universalism, let me just say that this division also between the more ecstatic understanding of the mystics and the more rational understanding of the dualists is yet another reason we have often been a little anxious about sexuality and its power. Because sexuality does include the power of passion. And often that passion has led people to violence. It is often a place in our lives where we don't necessarily feel as in control as we do in other parts of our lives. So there are so many reasons why sexuality has become a complicated thing for human beings. And all the more reason that we need, as religious folk, to think carefully about it. Well, we began to weigh in a more formal way in the late 60s and early 70s in About Your Sexuality, a curriculum that really very directly talked about sexuality and gave our young people the facts about sex. And as time went on and our understanding of sex began to expand and develop and complicate, we also went into our whole lives, which helped us even more expand our understanding of sexuality. At the core of that image is the idea that as we began to explore sexuality, we realized that sexuality included so many aspects of our being. Everything from the attitudes and feelings and experiences that we had, but also being influenced by our individual experiences, our family of origin, our culture, our religion, our spirituality, the laws around us, and our professional institutions and science and politics. And you'll see in front of you that this is not unique to Unitarian Universalism, but we understand sexuality in terms of these circles of sexuality, in which these different circles come together and influence each other, whether it is the sensuality component of it, or sexual health and reproduction, or sexual identity at the bottom. But at the center of each of these are a sense of values. And so we believe, as Unitarian Universalists, that when we talk about sexuality, it has implications in almost every part of our lives. But we also believe how important it is for us to steep those ideas in our values, both our individual values, what we value in our own lives, but also the values that hold us together as Unitarian Universalists. And so we believe when we talk about sexuality that there are certain values that are always at work. We believe that our sense of self-worth is essential to how we regard sexuality. We believe that sexual health and having the actual facts about what keeps the body healthy as a sexual being is essential. We believe that we need to exercise responsibility in the actions that we take as sexual beings. And we also believe that justice and inclusivity are always a part of sexuality in our world. Another component that is essential to us as Unitarian Universalists is that we believe that sexuality is actually a lifespan experience. From the moment that you are born until you take your last breath, in some way, sexuality in all of the complicated ways that this circle indicates are at work in our lives, and we at work in the midst of all of it. And so when we talk to our kindergartners about sexuality, we talk about it in terms of the birthing process, what it is that, what our babies are all about, and especially what happens when, as a kindergartner, you have a new baby in your family, and exploring how the very beginning concepts of our own bodies, in both the sense of how we're connected by bodies, but also how we have a sense of our own space as bodies, and what families are about in all of the complicated interactions. But it goes all the way to our newest curriculum and one of our most popular, which is for older adults, which looks at what happens to the body as it ages, but also what are some of the things that are both gifts and challenges in terms of sexuality as we age. And it helping older people, many of whom are beginning to date again for the first time, or at least trying to connect with other people, especially if they've lost their partner, how it is at an age that they can find appropriate ways to make those connections. The thing is that in addition to all of this, which is very heady, one of the aspects of this that is so important and harkens back to Audre Lorde's words is we believe that it's important to remember that always, at its best, sexuality and the erotic has to do with pleasure and joy. And so we seek in how we talk about it and explore it together to maintain our connection with those ideas and experiences. One of the things that almost every level of the curriculum, once it begins to talk very specifically about our bodies, is helping us understand the places in our body that are more likely to be pleasurably stimulated when touched in a romantic way. Most of the time, in most curriculums out in the world, when we talk about sexuality, we talk about genitalia and the body mostly in terms of reproduction, but rarely in terms of what is it that brings pleasure to each other and how can you establish how to do that in an intimate relationship. The other thing that we learn as essential that we never want to lose is that sexuality and justice are deeply connected. When we talked about that dualism at the very beginning, what contemporary critics have talked about is how that often has found its way into racist and sexist and gender-phobic understandings of sexuality. And that part of what we need to do in a full scope of sexuality is to embrace the concern for gender equality, for reproductive rights, for health care and the right to privacy, not to mention education, for all persons, so that they may have their dignity as well as joy in their lives. And as our Lord reminds us, that sense of joy actually asks something from us. Because if we have given ourselves fully to joy in our lives, we know the particular heightened sense of living that it offers us. And so part of what this whole curriculum invites us to think about is how all of the ways that we connect with the erotic, and she gave us so many examples, not just the traditional ways, how that sense of deep pleasure and joy may animate our lives and ask us to not accept the mediocre or living less than our full lives over and over again. So, as we think about this idea of gender, sexuality, pleasure, passion, intimacy in our lives, there are so many layers. And that's why it is appropriate that we think about it as our whole lives. And we continue to explore what it means to live our whole lives. The academic Omasika Tinsley, for instance, has been writing for several years about the sexuality specifically of black women, and how often in our culture there is what she calls a misogynoir, predilection that really tends to place women in a very limited image of themselves, especially black women in their culture. And so she seeks to liberate that idea in how people explore that together and how women understand their own bodies and their own choices. So we continue to expand on our understanding of the ways that sexuality, intimacy, our bodies invite us to rethink old ideas. So I am grateful that I'm part of a tradition that honors our whole lives, that invites us to explore intimacy throughout our lifetime. I've been deeply moved by being part of those classes where our teenagers are given a space where they can be courageous enough to ask the questions that they need to know as they explore their sexuality. And to see the sense of joy of being in a class with some of our older adults as they are really beginning to think about the possibilities of in that phase of their life of what it might mean to be a more intimate and sexual being again, or continue to do that in ways that feel more satisfying and well authenticated in their life. Most of all, by being a part of this and giving people the facts that they need, giving people the space to explore their values in the midst of it, understanding how pleasure and justice in equal measure are essential to our lives, it really does steep us in thinking that we need to hold on to and value in our community life. At its best, when we are part of this sort of undertaking around sexuality and spirituality, we honor honest and accurate information about sexuality, and we realize that it actually changes lives. It dismantles stereotypes and assumptions. It builds self-acceptance and self-esteem. It can foster healthy relationships. It allows us the agency more of decision-making in our lives. And as we have seen over and over again in young people who might otherwise hear messages that they are less than, it has literally saved lives. So, on this morning, when we think about cultivating relationships, may we honor the power of the erotic, the power of deep connection and intimacy, the power of loving our bodies just as they are. All of these things bring us into a holier place and make our lives together better. For that, I am deeply grateful. Amen, and blessed be. I invite you to join us in our closing hymn. Hymn number 307, The Human Touch Can Light the Flame. If you are looking at the hymnal, though, you will not want to look at the notes because we're going to sing it to a different melody, and I think you'll recognize that melody. We invite you to join us in hymn number 307. And now, as we return to our chalices, we leave this gathered community, but we don't leave our connection, our concerns, our care for each other. Our service to each other, to the world, to our faith continues. Until we are together, friends, be strong, be well, be true, be loving. We extinguish this light, but not the light of wisdom, the fire of our commitment to what matters, not the warmth of human love and connection. These remain until we gather in this place again. Thank you for joining us together this morning. We look forward to sharing our service next week. Have a great week.